Pete Wharmby, Supporting an Autistic Child's Education.
Comment appuyer un enfant autiste dans son éducation?
Pete is an autistic speaker, writer, tutor, and parent who is working to improve autism acceptance in society by sharing insights and experiences of autism to the widest possible audience. He has spoken at many conferences and events, often as the keynote speaker, on topics such as autism in education, the experience of autistic students and teachers, the importance of monotropism and special interests, and more. Pete's first book, What I Want to Talk About, was released earlier this year, and his second, Untypical, is scheduled for release in 2023.
Pete est un orateur sur le spectre de l'autisme, un écrivain, un tuteur, un parent qui travaille à améliorer l'acceptation de l'autisme dans la société en partageant des idées et des expériences de l'autisme au public le plus large que possible. Il a pris la parole à de nombreuses conférences et événements, souvent à titre de conférencier principal, sur des sujets comme l'autisme dans l'éducation, l'expérience des élèves et des enseignants-enseignantes autistes, l'importance du monotropisme et des intérêts particuliers, et bien plus encore. Le premier livre de Pete, What I Want to Talk About, est sorti plus tôt cette année et son second, Untypical, devra sortir en 2023.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the Autism Canada Awesome Conference. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you all today. I'm going to speak about something that really is quite important to me, which is autism and autistic students in particular in education. As an ex-teacher, I taught English in secondary school over here in the UK for 13 years. I have obviously come into contact with quite a number of autistic students who have had their various kind of challenges and experiences of the school system. And I've come away from my time in education with a very deep-seated feeling that we're failing autistic students. And by we, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm kind of using we in a very collective sense. I suppose what I really mean is humanity, or at the very least, Western educational kind of standards are failing autistic students quite considerably. And I've gone on to record several times, and I've said the same in my books as well, that that secondary schools in particular, although primary schools do feature too, are actually quite intensely hostile environments for a great many autistic students, just by the very way that they're set up, by their very fabric, if you like. It's part, I suppose, of just the inherent unsuitability of the world for neurodivergent people. And I've often said that a lot of this unsuitability or lack of capacity to work for the benefit of autistic people is actually, mostly accidental. I don't for a moment believe that much of it is purposeful or done on purpose, to cause harm. I think it just kind of is. And a lot of the time it's not noted and it's not realised just how big a problem that there is. So obviously I'm going to come into this talk today from a relatively negative viewpoint, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. I'm not trying to be a downer or to cause problems. I'm just trying to highlight that there is a problem, and it's really quite urgent that we work as a kind of collective to make improvements there, because of course we're talking about people, we're talking about children and their futures and their lives, so obviously it really is worthwhile trying to get something sorted there. But I'm going to start with how things were for me when I was a teacher prior to 2017, because that was the time before I realised or knew that I was autistic myself. Okay, I had no idea. It didn't really occur to me at all. It wasn't something that I had considered. I was just a secondary school English teacher getting by in the world. But I do remember how the autistic students, because of course I knew about the students, we'd been told about them. Every year we were given the heads up as to which students in our classes were on the autistic spectrum, as they said, or ASD, and we were given training. We were told how to work with autistic students, how best to to interact with them, and how to get the best out of them. And it's really there that I want to start, because that was really my first true understanding of autism, apart from a few cultural things that had trickled through into my mind, such as, the Rain Man, the Dustin Hoffman film from the 80s, and Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I remember reading when I was at university, I think. I'd had little cultural snippets to do with autism kind of had filtered through, but hadn't really left much of a mark. I didn't really consider it. But I did have this insight and this look at what autistic students were like through being at school with them, through teaching them on a daily basis in the classroom, teaching English. But what we were given, and the information that we were given, and the way that autistic students were generally often talked about was not great. And that was my first true, interaction with the world of autism. A kind of feeling that, my goodness, we're being quite, we're quite judgmental about these kids. We talk about them in quite a judgmental tone, and there were aspects of how these students were discussed and explained to us, often by neurotypical individuals, who weren't themselves autistic, that now I look back were quite distasteful, and not a really very good way of looking at things. I remember very vividly being told repeatedly, very confidently as well, that autistic students had zero empathy. They could not feel empathy. They could not understand other people's points of view. They could not understand why people might do the things that they do, or that other people had a different experience of the world to what theirs is. I was also told very frequently that autistic students did not understand humour, and that autistic students would struggle with concepts such as metaphor and simile, imagery and comparisons and that kind of thing, which obviously as an English teacher was quite a big deal, because that's quite a lot of what we talk about in class, when we're reading a book or a poem. They're kind of quite important concepts. So I used to come away from these training sessions with a kind of general sense that, goodness me, autistic people really are very, very different to me, which is ironic, and a feeling that trying to teach them English, for example, would be very challenging indeed, and that obviously there were huge barriers there that would make teaching English as a subject particularly difficult. I also remember that very often the behaviours that autistic students displayed were viewed slightly humorously, as being quite peculiar, often in a very light-hearted, endearing kind of way, like, oh, bless them, isn't that sweet? Or look at them over there doing their thing. Oh, how lovely. Which at the time I thought was just perfectly reasonable. And I was just like, okay, yeah, we're being respectful, we're being nice. But now I look back and realise that, there's a lot of problems with that kind of viewpoint. I remember vividly, there were, some autistic students who would act in an animal-like fashion, for example, behaving like a dog or an animal of some kind. And it was always presented to us that this was just their behaviour. This is just something that they did. They liked to pretend to be a bear or a dog or whatever it might be. And that we were to kind of humour them, I suppose, but that we should be firm with them, and make it clear when this is no longer acceptable. Come on now, you can't be a bear any longer. And so on and so forth. This was how it was presented to us. And as a person who had no knowledge of autism whatsoever at that stage, I absorbed all of this fairly uncritically. I just took it on board and I tried to make the best of it, and I tried to make use of that in the classroom, and I tried to use what they told us in order to be a better teacher for the autistic students that I worked with. I realise now, of course, that none of those things actually helped in the way that they were meant to, and that actually, through doing the things that I was told to do, I was probably causing more harm than good. But I'll come back to that in a moment. The thing is, while all this was going on, and I was doing these teacher training sessions, and I was meeting more and more autistic students in my classes, in the background of my life, if you like, things were happening. And I was starting to suffer from some mental health difficulties. Depression and anxiety being the two really key ones. And at the time, I had no idea why this was. I'd always actually been a relatively I'd enjoyed pretty good mental health up to that point. I really had, and I look back now at those times, in my 20s and my teens, thinking, wow, how lucky I was, not to have any of those problems and difficulties. So they hit me as a bit of a shock. They came out of seemingly nowhere, and all of a sudden I was feeling very different to how I'd felt before. I was feeling very much like I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live life the way that I was used to any longer. I remember for a time thinking that it must be some kind of like early midlife crisis. I was in my mid-30s, early to mid-30s, and I thought maybe that's what this is, just a kind of feeling of, change or shifting into that later stage of life. It was a struggle. It was very, very difficult. And even now, talking about it, with the hindsight that I have, isn't always a pleasurable experience, because it was very, very difficult. And it was made worse by this feeling of, where's this coming from? What is this? Why on earth am I suddenly struggling with all of these ordinary day-to-day things that I'm, let's face it, used to doing and have had no problem with before? Very, very alarming thing to live through, I felt. And my heart will always and forever go out to anyone who's experiencing mental health difficulties for that reason, because it is genuinely very frightening to have your brain suddenly view the world and view everything in it and the people in it differently in this very negative, pessimistic way. But I had to know what was going on here. I had to know why it was that I was struggling in this way. So I started to cast around a little bit to try to work out where the root cause of this was. And I had no luck whatsoever. I'm not very good at research. I'm not very good at kind of delving deeply into something unless I have a very particular interest in it, of course. So I struggled to find anything that was useful to me. I just kind of ended up revolving around the usual things like, finding out why depression exists and so on and so forth, never managing to break through to that root cause. But my partner messaged me one day. I think I was out for a coffee, trying to calm, trying to relax, as best as I could. They messaged me with a simple message of, have you ever looked into autism? And I hadn't, apart from what I've already mentioned. But I did. I trusted them enough. I thought, yeah, okay, I'll have a look into this. And so I delved quite deeply into what autism is all about. And what I found was very interesting, because I found two strata of information. On one level, I found the information that was given by doctors, professors, researchers, scientists of various stripes, all of whom presenting this pathologized view of what autism is, filled with deficit messages about, autistic people can't do this, autistic people can't do that, autistic people struggle with X, Y, and Z. And while I was reading that stuff, I couldn't find anything there really to hook into what I felt as an individual, apart from a few little bits here and there, because I'd done quite well up to this point in my life. I could make eye contact, so that was a big reason not to go down this route. I'd been in a band, I'd been a lead singer in a band for about 5 or 6 years in my 20s. And that did not sit well with the diagnostic criteria, or at least much of the diagnostic criteria, or much of what these doctors and scientists were telling me about autism. It didn't sync up at all. So I was very close to moving elsewhere and looking into other possibilities as to why I felt the way that I did. But then I found that other strata, that other tier of information, which was provided by autistic people themselves, online, using the medium of Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. TikTok wasn't a thing at that point, but there was a lot of it out there, a lot of autistic people shouting into the world about their existence, and there was a very distinct sense that not many people were listening, but I was intently listening, because I'd suddenly found all of these people who were reporting the same experiences that I had had throughout my entire life. And I can't really express how bizarre and yet comforting that experience is. It's something that I still look back on today with tremendous fondness, In fact, I was speaking to somebody last night about it online, of course, just about how much of a sense of belonging it gave me all of a sudden. And it changed, obviously, it changed everything, because it was from that early interaction with autistic individuals that I began my journey of diagnosis, of being diagnosed as autistic in 2017 at the age of 34, and then moving on to being something of an advocate myself, something, becoming a writer, speaking about it like I am now, sharing my experiences as widely as I possibly could, adding my voice to that chorus of autistic voices saying, please listen to us, because what we have to say is actually quite important. And so it was. I found on that November morning in 2017 a fresh diagnosis of autism in my hand, that this was my life now. And what began was a long period of reassessing and reevaluating every part of my life up to that date. Because it changes everything. Learning that the architecture of your brain, the way that your brain works, is considerably different to that of everyone else, is quite a huge thing to process. It really is. Because at the age of 34, I had everything to look back on. I had my 20s and all of the adventures and various things that had occurred to me in that time, including things to do with employment, with friendships, with relationships, with my hobbies, with the band that I mentioned. I had my university time to look back over and reevaluate and try to work out what was really going on there. Moving further back, I had my late teen years, the experience of puberty, of growing up, and of course, the experience of school. All of this I had to significantly reevaluate through this new vital lens of neurodivergence. And I described it at the time, and I have done many times since, as being a little bit like when you, there's that thing that you're meant to do with your computer or your laptop every now and then. You're meant to defrag it. You're meant to take the hard drive and tell it to rearrange everything in a way that makes more sense, because the idea is it will make your computer work more efficiently and more effectively. Well, it was a bit like that. I had to take everything that was in my head and kind of rearrange it all, twist it around, put it back together again until it all made a little bit more sense with this vital new information. And that was a very, very tiring process to go through. Very, very tiring indeed. But at the end of it, I felt that things in my life that up to that point had made very little sense, often, almost total nonsense, suddenly made sense. And these little moments of shame and guilt and wonder as to, why on earth did you do that? What on earth made you think that way in that moment? It all suddenly makes abundant sense. And you can start to forgive yourself, I find, for all of the things that up to that point you might have beat yourself up for a little bit. It's something that I often come across with people who are diagnosed quite late on, that they look back at their life with a sense of shame, to quote the Pet Shop Boys, because of all the different things that went wrong for them and all the moments, social interactions that went horribly wrong, and moments where they had to run away from a social event, out of just sheer exhaustion. Just so many occurrences where things have gone wrong that, you end up feeling very ashamed of your past, and learning that you're autistic and that you didn't do those things because you're a horribly flawed character, but because you're disabled and these things are too difficult for you and you have to be kind to yourself. It frees you. It frees you from that kind of prison of shame, if you like. And that's a hugely big deal. And one reason why, I wish that diagnosis was more easily accessible for everyone who needed it, and of course we know that it isn't, and we know that there are many intersections in society who struggle to manage to get that diagnosis. And it's something we really need to work on. But to go back to finding all this out about oneself, what you realise on a fundamental level is that being autistic affects everything. about your life. It's as if it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. It's the solid rock or the shifting sands that you build yourself and your life and your personality and your achievements all upon. And for that reason, not knowing what it is obviously very, very difficult to live with and to understand. But also now knowing that it's there, knowing that your life is built on that foundation, it enables you to recognize that those people of us who are autistic are so different and our experiences are so different that there needs to be a whole extra level of acceptance and understanding if autistic people are to be happy in the world, because it's so different, because of that completely different set of foundations. And that, of course, going back to where I started, is not what I found when I was in rooms with teachers discussing autistic students, discussing how they behave, how they work, what they need, and so on and so forth. Because there was very little comprehension or time taken to understand the fact that literally every single thing that autistic child is experiencing is different to your neurotypical way of looking at the world. So that's really where I want to go now in this conversation. Just how different is it? How little are we doing to help autistic students through this? And what's the end game? Where are we aiming for here? You know, what are we hoping is going to happen in the end? So let's go back to the students who I was told so confidently that they couldn't understand sarcasm, they couldn't understand irony, they couldn't understand imagery or anything that was non-literal or humour or empathy. Well, of course, we know pretty well by this point that there are many, many autistic people, possibly most, although I would hesitate to be quite so firm in that, autistic people understand those things. We might not understand them in the moment. You know, it might take us a bit more time to recognise, oh, you're joking. Oh, okay. Or is that sarcasm? Kind of feels like it. Just checking. Is it? Okay, fine. Yeah, that might happen. But we're not totally cut off from those things as concepts. Not by any stretch. In fact, some of the best writers that I know are autistic, and you don't get to be a good writer without understanding humour and metaphor and empathy and all these kinds of things. So much of what we were told, much of what I was personally told about autism was completely wrong. Okay, it was built on something from an earlier period, something that was predicated on earlier research, which had been very, very limited in its scope, only taking into account a very small number of autistic people who, yes, indeed, maybe did have some issues pertaining to sarcasm or irony or humour, well, whichever you want to pick. But it wasn't broad enough, and therefore, you know, the vast majority of autistic people's experiences were kept out of the equation, were ignored, and were seen as being not to do with autism at all. And so in 2012, 2013, 2014, I was being told as a teacher, yes, indeed, autistic students cannot do these things. They do not understand these things. Because there is the problem, you see. When non-autistic people, when these trainers and other teachers and teaching assistants and all of these people were informing me and my fellow staff about what autism is, they were viewing it through a neurotypical lens. They were viewing autistic behaviour through the lens of their own behaviour. And I think that this is something that people have always done. You know, whenever we view anything that's slightly different, we compare it to our own experience and we say, well, that's different because it's different to what I do. Okay? And because of that, I'm going to view that with suspicion or be slightly bemused by it or whatever it might be. And I think it's very similar with this situation, because you can't view autistic people's behaviour through the lens of neurotypical behaviour, because it's different, in the same way that you can't view what a fish does through the lens of what a bird does. Not trying to make any comparison there that autistic people like fish, because we're really not, but I'm sure you get the analogy that, it's a fool's errand. It doesn't help anybody. You can't view how autistic people interact and socialize and deal with stress and move through the world. You can't compare that to how non-autistic people do it, because all you're going to come up against is constant deficits. Constant, you don't do this as well as we do. You can't do this as well as I can, and so on and so forth. And in the process, of course, the positives, those good differences are ignored or cast aside. What you have to do, and this is something that is proving to be very difficult, I think, is view autistic people's behaviour and our needs and our attitudes and our lives without any kind of lens at all, other than just, pure, objective, I want to learn. I just want it to tell me, and I want to learn, and I will act on the information that I'm given. That's what needs to happen. We need autistic people to be not compared with everyone else. We want our behaviour and how we interact with the world to be viewed as its own thing, on its own merits. Yes, it's different. That does not mean that it is inferior. It will, obviously, differ from how you do things, but we have our reasons for doing them. Okay? So to go back to these students that we were told about back when I was doing my teacher training and back when I was getting my advice from neurotypical professionals about how to deal with autistic people. Well, that student then, for example, who goes around acting as an animal, don't view that behaviour through your lens. Don't view that behaviour as being an aberration or a peculiarity. Don't assume that they're playing. Just because that's your first kind of port of call for a child acting like an animal. Because you might remember when you were a child, you sometimes pretended to be a dog or a cat for fun. Okay? Don't assume that. Don't make the assumption that they're doing it for the same reasons you were. Because if you assume that, you're almost certainly going to be wrong. You have to understand, of course, that an autistic child doing that, pretending to be an animal, may very well have reasons that are actually very, very good to do that. Really sound reasons why actually they might feel more comfortable pretending to be an animal in this terrifically hostile, frightening environment that you're insisting on keeping them in. I'll talk about it a little bit now, actually, while we're on the subject. Because if a school truly is a hostile environment, and I genuinely believe that it is for most autistic students, it's going to obviously be very stressful. And what do we do when we're stressed? Well, we have responses to stress, don't we? And they can vary enormously from person to person. Some people get very confident and cocky and, extroverted in order to try to combat that sneaking stress that's getting to them. Others clam up in their shell, become introverted. Others still do other things. I don't know, things like doodling or stimming, if you're autistic, of course, is a very common one. Well, one thing that you can do when you're really stressed is pretend to not be there. Literally just pretend I'm not here anymore. I'm not in this school. Or if I am in this school, I am not in this school anymore. Instead, I am a cat. Because, quite frankly, if I'm a cat right now, that makes everything an awful lot more reasonable and easy to deal with. And I saw that in the students that I worked with. Even when I didn't recognise that I was autistic, I saw that there was something going on there that was causing them to behave in this way that actually made sense. Admittedly, I didn't know what it was at that point, but I do now. So we have to, as a collective, neurotypical and neurodivergent teachers and governments and people in charge and with power, we collectively have to make sure that we're no longer making these assumptions and viewing autistic students' behaviour through a neurotypical lens, because it has its own reasons, it has its own causes. So let's go through then in a bit more detail, because I've teased it time and time again now, about why it is that schools are a hostile environment and why therefore autistic students might find themselves having to engage in behaviours that you might not understand? Well, the first thing, of course, is going to be to do with the social aspect of schooling. You know, autistic people very often have difficulties with social interactions. You know, we can be misinterpreted very easily. We in turn misinterpret others quite regularly. I know that I do, because of that different way that we communicate. You know, different ways of doing things. It's very likely that an autistic student may well find themselves having experienced several quite crucial misunderstandings before the first lesson even has a chance to begin, because it happens that frequently. And that, of course, is going to get somebody down. You know, if they're constantly having these misunderstandings with their friends or with people in positions of power, that is going to be tiring and stressful and cause all kinds of problems. So, and you're surrounded by, you know, hundreds of other individuals. So these social interactions and social moments will occur with tremendous frequency throughout the day. It's no wonder that many autistic students choose to go and find a quiet spot where they can hide and get away from that for a time. Then you've got the sensory aspect. You've got the fact that for a lot of autistic students, much about school is going to be intolerable from a sensory processing perspective. So we've got, for example, the loud noises, the raucous chatter in the corridors, the loudness of children shouting and screaming and playing football or whatever it might be on the playing fields or in the playground. You've got the incessant ticking of the very loud clock in every classroom. You've got the hum of the air conditioning. You've got the hum of the projectors shining very bright lights on the board. You've got the posters, colourful, covered in words, surrounding every student in every classroom, demanding to be read and demanding to be absorbed. I can't be in a room with that much information on the walls without desperately needing to read every little bit of it. And then you've got the smells. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in this country there is a very distinct smell in various parts of the school. The science labs have a very kind of, I've never been able to describe it. I don't know whether it's the Bunsen burners, I don't know whether it's the teachers, I have no idea what that smell is, but it's constant and it's quite strong. The design and technology department, the woodworking department, has a constant smell of sawdust and so on and so forth. Teachers with their perfume and air conditioning, with their perfume and aftershave, and rooms with those diffusers with the reeds, you know, kind of wafting off delicious scents that, you know, you may very well love, but are a source of tremendous discomfort for autistic students. I could go on, but I don't want to overdo it, you know. But as I'm sure you can see, the problems are fairly big. You know, these are significant hurdles for an autistic student to overcome. And of course, it's worth remembering that they're the ones that have got to overcome it. The other neurotypical students don't have to worry about any of this. You know, they haven't got any of this bothering them at all, probably. You know, not much of it, certainly not as much of it as the autistic students. So, you know, if you're going to compare how the autistic students are behaving to the neurotypical students and how they're behaving, well, that's not quite fair, is it? Because they're both experiencing a very different environment. And then you've got the power play. Traditionally, many autistic people struggle with the politics of power, the dance of power, if you like, you know, the obsequiousness to people who are in charge. Autistic people, in my experience, and I count myself in this, tend to need some kind of very clear reason or evidence why this person, whoever they may be, deserves to be in power and deserves to be respected. And of course, that's very problematic in a school, because teachers have a bit of a mantra, don't they? Especially senior teachers, that you know, they should be respected straight away. You know, just because that's, you know, they're teachers. That's how it's got to be. And I think that can often butt up quite badly with some autistic students. Suffice to say, it is a hostile environment. I don't believe it means to be. I don't believe it sets out to be, but it is. And the sooner we accept that, the sooner we recognise that very simple fact, the better. So if you have children existing in an environment that is tremendously hostile to them all of the time, then obviously you're going to start seeing some behaviours that you might label challenging, or at the very least peculiar, like the pretending kind of behaviour. The problem is with teachers, those in education, viewing that behaviour as challenging, or at least in the way that they understand that word, which is to mean that it's challenging of their authority, it's challenging of their position in the classroom, and it's challenging of the ability then for the education to continue. This is a very neurotypical way of looking at things. This is looking at it through the lens of neurotypicality, when in reality, if it is challenging at all, it is actually challenging to the structures of the school. It's challenging in a sense of it is pushing at them in order to try to make them work better. Or at the very least, it is showing up where the real problems lie and where the issues are in how the school is set up. The challenging behaviour of an autistic student is actually tremendously useful in showing you where the school is not doing enough in order to be truly inclusive. And I think that that is the thing that a lot of people find difficult to accept, because we're so used to viewing this behaviour as just being, without any kind of clarification, just bad. This is bad behaviour. Students should not behave like this. If a student is behaving like this, then they must be not necessarily punished, but they need to stop doing it. And the onus is very heavily on the student. The student is doing X, Y, and Z. The student is pretending to be a cat. This has to stop, and it is the student's job to stop it. That's the norm, isn't it? That's the standard. That's how schools have always worked, as far as I'm aware, certainly in my lifetime. It is the onus of the student to stop doing the bad thing. What we need to do is take that step back and reevaluate the bad thing and recognise it for what it is. It is a response. Now, they say, don't they, that all behaviour is communication. And I know in this country, at the very least, there are lots of arguments around that. There are people on both sides of that argument. Some people say, yes, indeed, all behaviour is communication and should therefore be scrutinised to find, what the real reason is. Others are more along the lines of, well, but it's still bad behaviour, and it's still disrupting and it's causing problems for the other students and we're not getting enough learning done, etc., etc., etc. I don't want to wade too heavily into that debate. What I do want to say, though, is that autistic students, to an extent at least, stand outside of that debate because their challenging behaviour, for the most part, I'm not. In all fairness, I have to acknowledge, I have to accept that yes, some autistic students will probably just delight in being naughty. I know that sometimes I did. Sometimes it's just fun. I don't want to excuse the entirety of neurodivergent land, of that, because obviously it can happen. But talking generally, I think we need to take the autistic challenging behaviour out of that discussion and say, well, actually, this isn't really the same kind of thing. This challenging behaviour that we see from the autistic students is literally a result of systemic failures of the school and the wider education system to adapt themselves for the student. Because that's what ultimately has to happen. We cannot continue to force or to expect to force autistic students to modify their own behaviour. The thing is, the tragic thing is, of course, they do. They try to a lot of the time. I did. I desperately tried to fit the standards of what was expected when I was a student myself, but it's corrosive and it leads to autistic masking, pretending, pretending that nothing's getting to you and pretending that you're not a ball of horrifying anxiety at the end of the school day. And that eventually leads to burnout, which I believe is what caused my depression and anxiety that I spoke about earlier. No longer being able to wear that mask any longer. So we have to stop expecting autistic students to carry the load of this, because, as I say, the tragedy is they really will try to. which is impressive, isn't it? I mean, it breaks my heart, to be honest, when I think about the number of autistic students who are desperately trying to fit to fit their expectations of the school around them, and to not stand out and to not challenge and to not struggle. We have to stop that. We have to take a step back, as I keep saying, and look at this system and think, right, we have to change. We have to. The schools, the education system, government, whatever it is that's involved, wherever the stakeholders are, they have to do the adaptation so that we're not forcing already very vulnerable autistic students to do that. Because it's unreasonable. It's deeply, deeply unreasonable to expect autistic students to carry that load so consistently and so often. So when I was learning all of these things before I learned I was autistic, I was blasé about it. I went along with it. I thought these people knew best, and I thought that they had the best interests of the autistic people at heart. And I'm not doubting for a moment that they think that too. I'm sure they thought they were helping too. But I feel that things are starting to change now, and realising that actually that isn't the way to go. That we can't view autistic behaviour in this simplistic 1980s, 1990s way anymore. We have to recognise there's something much bigger going on here. That there is a large number of people that share this planet who have a different way of looking at things and who are constantly striving to manage and to cope in a world that is not built for them. People in work, in employment, trying to work in offices that are no good for them, that, clash with their neurodivergence, and students in schools trying to get by in this hostile environment that is constantly damaging them, on a regular basis. And we need to call time on that and really start to make these systemic changes that need to occur. And the biggest way to do that is to ensure that we are all viewing autistic students' behaviour and autistic students' lives through the autistic lens, not the neurotypical one. That even if you yourself are neurotypical, that you can view these students knowing that they are different. Not in a scary way, not in a negative way, a deficit model. They are simply different. They have a different way of looking at things. And I genuinely believe that if that were more widespread, if that understanding and that way of viewing things was more widespread, then schools and education boards and all those, bodies that exist would start to begin the very slow grinding shift to making themselves more comfortable for autistic individuals, autistic students, and, in all fairness, autistic teachers too, because there's plenty of those around as well. So the biggest thing I learned, I think, in my journey from teacher to autistic person, or somebody who recognises their own autism, to somebody who now writes and speaks about autism, is to do with this difference. We often talk of the danger of reduced expectations when working with disabled students, autistic, neurodivergent students. We don't want to, reduce the expectations of how well they might do, for example, or how much they might achieve in their school life. But I think it does boil down to expectations. If we're to view autistic students through the autistic lens rather than the neurotypical lens, it's about recognizing that our expectations have to be different. Not reduced, but just different. Understanding how autistic students react to stress, how they react to sensory issues, how they react to exam time, how they react to being told off, how they react to being under pressure with work, how they react to being told to write a page of writing, how they react to being asked in class to stand up and recite something. All of these are expectations that are different to the neurotypical majority, and you can't apply the same expectations across. If you are to view autistic students through the autistic lens, as I truly believe we have to, then these expectations have to shift and they have to be informed. And that will only happen, in my personal opinion, from listening and reading and learning from as many autistic individuals as you can possibly get your hands on. Not literally, but as many as you can possibly, manage to listen to and read and meet and talk to and learn from. And that's why we're here. There are many of us around. Here I am doing my thing. I've spoken to you about this for a good 45 minutes now. I'm not alone. There are hundreds, thousands of autistic individuals out there, online, most of them, because online is safe, relatively, for, introverts such as myself, ready to share our experiences and to talk about how we view the world and to help shift those expectations so that you can view things through that autistic lens rather than relying on that neurotypical lens, which really just doesn't work. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today. I hope it was informative and useful. I hope that if you yourself were autistic, that it rang true, and that it was something that you can recognise too. And I hope that for many of you, you may well have been sitting there thinking, well, actually, we don't do that. In my school, we don't do this. We try to view things from the autistic point of view, and in which case, I salute you wholeheartedly. Fantastic. More of that, please, as much as possible. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Connect with Pete. Communiquez avec Pete. www.petewharmby.com or on Twitter @comaficionado.